Welcome to the BRC Civics class. All lessons are available on our YouTube channel. Here we are, Article 3. Article 3 is the judicial branch. The judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court and other federal courts whose function is to rule on all matters related to the law and the Constitution. The Supreme Court has a ton of power that has continued to grow since its beginning in 1789. Unlike the other branches of government, justices aren't elected. The president nominates Supreme Court members, as well as federal courts of appeals and district court judges. The Senate then has to vote, confirm, or reject the appointment. Justices don't have term limits, which I think is ridiculous. They're able to serve until they die, retire, or are removed by Congress through impeachment and conviction. The Constitution doesn't give any specific requirements for who can and cannot be a justice, which is crazy. In fact, federal law doesn't even require a federal judge to be an attorney. That's crazy. But traditionally, most of them have worked as lawyers. But you see how this could become a problem with all these unqualified folks in position of power within the government already. One of these idiots could become a justice if they haven't already. The power the Supreme Court wields is pretty vague in the Constitution, which is crazy. Section 1 identifies the Supreme Court as a third branch of government. It empowers the court to decide cases. Section 2 talks about jurisdiction. And Section 3 talks about regulations around treason cases, like the treason case that should have taken place but didn't for those January 6th idiots who tried to overthrow the government and assassinate the then Vice President and Speaker of the House. And they injured and killed police. But there are unwritten rules for white folks in this country. And January 6th is a prime example of white privilege. Just imagine if all of these folks behind me were black. I wonder what would have happened to them had they done the same crimes. There is no mention of interpreting the constitutionality of the laws, the very thing the Supreme Court is known for doing. So how did the Supreme Court get the power if it's not in the Constitution? Well, in 1803, the Supreme Court had a case called Marbury versus Madison. The case was complex. You see, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the law Marbury was using to make his case was unconstitutional. Marshall's ruling established that it was the U.S. Supreme Court's responsibility to interpret the constitutionality of the laws. And so the court's mandate of judicial review was born. And as the highest court in the country, decisions made by the Supreme Court are final, but not really, because a future Supreme Court can overturn a decision that they find unconstitutional, like the recent overturn of Roe v. Wade, which gave women the right to choose. Yeah, that's gone. Another well-known example of this was the Supreme Court's ruling in the case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which ruled racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. This overruled the Supreme Court's racist 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which had legally protected segregation as separate but equal, even though it was never separate but equal, and in fact, it was separate and unequal, which is the only reason why some black folks wanted segregation to end in the first place, because our people didn't get the same level of education or resources as white folks did. That's why you get taught an unfactual history about your people, because separate and unequal still exists for black folks. Because we have no what? Political power. And this racist society will never change out of the kindness of its heart, because that would reduce their power. And never forget, this is all about power. Anyway, when the Supreme Court makes a ruling, all other lower courts must follow the precedent. Unlike the president or Congress, courts only act if someone brings forward a valid case. And unlike the legislative and executive branches, the judicial branch operates outside of elections and voter input. But they have enormous power when it comes to our daily lives. By evaluating the constitutionality of laws to keep our government in check. At least that's what they're supposed to do. unless the majority of them are corrupt, like this disgrace, Clarence Thomas. And that's where we'll stop the lesson for today. In our next lesson, we're going to talk about the First and Second Amendment, freedom of speech, and the right to bear arms. As always, I love you, Black man. I love you, Black woman. Knowledge is power, power to the people.